Here are instructions to help you out with Lab 8, Faults and Folds. First of all, you're asked to draw a bird's eye view of a normal fault and a reverse fault. I'm going to do the reverse fault for you on the left, and then hopefully you get the idea and you can do the one on the right. We're looking down on the ground. It's a bird's eye view, and this is the fault that's breaking the surface. It tells you the hanging walls on the left, so we can go ahead and label the hanging wall and the footwall. We know when it's a reverse fault, there is compression, and the two sides of the fault are moving towards each other, so we can put these arrows here. We also know that in reverse faults, the hanging wall goes up relative to the footwall. So in this case, the mountains, which I've shaded in blue, are going to be on the hanging wall right at the edge of the fault. That's the part that's going to be pushed up and over the footwall. So you try the right-hand side. The next set of questions asks about left and right lateral strike slip faults. So I'm going to do the left and then you can do the right. Again, we're looking from a bird's eye view and here's the fault. What I've drawn here is a little river that has been offset by the fault. So first of all, when it comes to strike slip faults, there are no hanging walls or footwalls. Remember, it's a vertical fault. As I move along the river and I look across the fault, I see that it's been displaced to the left. If I came along the river on this side and looked across, I would also see that it's displaced to the left. And so that's a left lateral strike slip fault. The next set of questions asks you to do this in 3 dimensions. So again, I'll do the reverse fault. First, let's put our hanging wall and footwall on the same sides as they were in the previous part, and our fault. And now we have to put our fault below the surface in this 3rd dimension. And we know that the hanging wall is going to be above the fault trace, so it has to dip down and to the left. And you can put it anywhere, really, as long as it's dipping down and to the left. Remember that we said for reverse faults, the hanging wall is pushed up and over the footwall, so we can draw those arrows on the side view. And we can add our mountains. This might be an easier way to see how those mountains are forming as the hanging wall is pushed up. It asks us to also put in some rock units that are offset. So here I have a set of rock units, orange, green, and purple, that were once continuous across this fault, and now they've been displaced in the sense shown here as the arrows are indicating. Go ahead and try this for the normal fault. Finally, we were asked to do 3-dimensional block diagrams for the strike slip faults. So again, I'll do the left lateral one. Here's our fault plane. Remember, it's vertical. There's no hanging wall or footwall. So we just draw a vertical line deep into the earth. Then we have our arrows indicating that things have moved to the left, no matter what side of the fault you're on, looking across. And I'll put the stream on just to emphasize that it's been offset in a left lateral sense. Now this is a diagram that you had to download and print. And I'm sorry it's so dark. I have a different one that I usually use, but I haven't been able to locate it. And this is one we're going to have to use. We're going to put faults on here. We haven't really looked at faults in map view except for strike slip faults. So I want to use the notation, and I'm also going to color code. So strike slip faults, I'm going to indicate in red. And as we have done before, you indicate the place where the fault is, and then arrows indicate the direction. And I use little half arrows because sometimes it gets crowded on maps to draw the full arrows. Now this is the one that's going to be new. Normal faults. Normal faults do have a trace along the land, and when we draw them, the convention is to put a bar and a ball on the side of the fault that went down. You don't usually put the words up and down. I've just put them there to remind you. But the ball goes on the side that goes down. Then you have a reverse dip slip. This looks kind of like a convergent margin symbol, where you have the fault indicated with a line, and then you have teeth on the side that went up, or the hanging wall, relative to the other side. Again, I've put up and down for ease for you, but normally you wouldn't put that on a map. All right, so let's annotate our map. We're going to start with this trace right here. You should be able to pick out these features on the map because topography is shown really clearly. This first feature is the San Andreas Fault, right lateral strike slip fault. And I'm not going to put the word fault on all of these. I'm just going to say San Andreas because everything on here is going to be a fault. What's another major fault in California? Well, north of the San Andreas, we have another right lateral strike slip fault that's kind of a parallel or a sister fault to the San Andreas, and that's called the Hayward Fault. If we go down to Southern California, we have two additional right lateral strike slip faults that are similar to the San Andreas, and these are called the San Jacinto and the Elsinore faults. All of these faults are active and have had earthquakes upon them in the past 100 years. There's another strike slip fault that I'm going to put on here, but it's going to be in a very different direction. It's this one right here, and you can see it's almost perpendicular to the trace of the rest of the faults. Also, it's left lateral and not right lateral. This is called the Garlock Fault, and this goes along the northern margin of the Mojave Desert. This right here is the Mojave Desert. Now we're going to move on to some other faults. First of all, there's a major normal fault that I want to put on your map, and it's right here. If you see this shadowy, cliff-like mountain front, this is the Sierra Nevada Range mountain front, and this right here is Owens Valley. There's a huge normal fault that is allowing the mountains to go up and the valley to go down. It's called the Sierra Nevada Owens Valley Fault. I've used colors around the words to match them to the fault type. So all of these down here, these strike slip faults are sort of red, and this one is sort of green. Now we have two reverse faults, and I didn't want to use the dark purple color because I thought it might not show up very well, so I'm using white. But there's two reverse faults down here that I want to talk about. One of them is called the Sierra Madre Fault, and the other one is called the Santa Monica Fault. Now in the next diagram, where we have a closer up view of Los Angeles, you'll see these faults better. Another thing to notice on this diagram is the basin and range region out here that just merges right into California, right up into this bounding fault, the Sierra Nevada Owens Valley Fault. You can really see the range basin, all of them trending north-south from stretching that's been going on for the past 15 to 20 million years. Now this is a diagram that you have in your lab, and I've put PCC on there just for orientation's sake. We're going to start with what I think you could almost pick out as the major trace of the San Andreas Fault going through the diagram. Of course, it's right lateral, strike slip, San Andreas. Here's the San Jacinto Fault that I showed you earlier, and the Elsinore Fault. The Elsinore Fault at the northern end gets complicated and splays off into different kinds of structures. Also, there's the Garlock up there, just barely in the corner of this diagram. There are some more San Andreas parallel faults that I want to show you on here. Here's one, and this one is called the Newport Inglewood Fault because it goes all the way from Inglewood down to Newport. And there's another one that clips off the peninsula right here, which is the Palos Verde Peninsula, and it's called the Palos Verde Fault. All of these are accommodating northwest-southeast motion between the Pacific and North American plates. Let's look at those reverse faults a little more carefully. Right here at the base of the San Gabriel Mountains is the Sierra Madre Fault. And then further along over here and into the ocean is the Santa Monica Fault. The Hollywood Hills and the Santa Monica Hills, where the big Hollywood sign are all being uplifted along the Santa Monica Fault. And the San Gabriel Mountains in Pasadena are also being uplifted along that major reverse fault. Finally, there's one more fault that I'm going to squeeze in here, only because it's close to us. Right there. It goes just about through South Pasadena, and it's a strike-slip left lateral fault. It's called the Raymond Fault. And this fault is active, and you can actually see expressions of it if you know where to look in Pasadena. Before I go on to show you a picture with the Raymond Fault location, I want to mention that these are the major faults in our region. These are the big structures. There are hundreds and maybe even thousands of smaller reverse and strike slip faults in the Los Angeles area. So here's the Raymond Fault. Now let me get you oriented. North is up. Here's Lake Avenue coming down, crossing California Boulevard. Here's Caltech. Here's PCC. As Lake Avenue starts to wind and turn, it passes the Ritz-Carlton, where there's a hill. That hill is actually created by the Raymond Fault. It also goes through the Huntington Gardens over here. If you've ever entered the gardens and you've noticed that there's a big slope downward towards the main gardens, that's also part of the Raymond Fault. So the Raymond Fault, even though it's a strike slip left lateral fault, has a little bit of vertical motion as well, making it a bit more complicated than the simple kinds of faults we've been talking about. However, this is by far the closest to PCC that is active. The last part of your exercise asks you to draw synclines and anticlines. So I'm going to do the syncline. I've got the ground surface here indicated with a little tree to make sure you realize we're looking below the surface. And synclines are folds that go in this orientation, like a smile. I kind of remember that because smile and syncline both begin with S. So if we draw a bunch of rock layers that have been bent into a syncline below the surface, it would look like this. If we're going to draw the axial plane, which is the point where the bend is the greatest, it's going to be sort of around here. This is a pretty symmetric fold, so it doesn't have a real striking axial plane. Finally, what are the age of the rock units? Well, in geology, there's a law that the rocks on the bottom are oldest, and as you go upwards, the rocks become younger and younger because they're laid on top of each other like the layers of a cake. So the youngest rocks are in the middle of this fold, and the oldest are out here. And I color them just to make that obvious. So if you're walking along the ground and you don't know what's below you, you would see old rocks, and they would get younger and younger and younger, and then you would start passing back into older and older and older rocks. This is going to be a little bit different than what you find when you do your anticline. That's it. I hope this helped, and good luck with the lab.